Where River Turns to Sky. Presentation brought to you by Jacob, Julie, Tammy, Alex, Jeff, and myself, Brooke. The setting of this story takes place in Looking Glass, Oregon, which is located in the valley of Douglas County in Oregon. Next, let's discuss the characters. Let's start with George Castor. George Castor is an active 80-year-old farmer from Oregon, devastated and guilt-ridden over his best friend Ralph dying alone at Silver Gardens Nursing Home. George makes a promise to Ralph to never let anyone else die alone. With the inheritance from his deceased son, he buys an old rundown mansion painted red and makes plans to fulfill his promise. With the help of a quirky mystic Grace, George convinces 4 residents of the gardens to move into his new home. George soon creates a family out of 6 people living together in his mansion. George works passionately to ensure that everyone lives their lives to the fullest. He takes them on a field trip to the forest where they skinny dip under a waterfall, instigates a food fight at the dinner table, and builds a baseball diamond in his yard so that they can play baseball, and also takes them to the beach. During these adventures, George grows weaker and weaker as the cancer starts to take over his body. Determined to depart on his own terms, he throws a wake for himself before he dies and later passes away in his home surrounded by his new family. Next up, we have Ralph. Ralph is George's best friend who suffered from a stroke and passed away while George was away on a fishing trip. Ralph was George's neighbor, and they first met when he and his wife came over to welcome George and his family into the neighborhood. George and Ralph enjoyed going on fishing trips at Odell Lake together where they would partake in endless conversations with one another and drink Dr. Jack, which is Jack Daniels. Next, we have Grace. Grace is a quirky mystic with a pet dog that Clara would call Skunk, and a lover for candles and stories. A storyteller at the garden, she comes to live at the mansion and helps recruit others from the nursing home. Grace lights candles and communicates with the spirits. She is not afraid of the afterlife at all, and is always concerned about the souls of the other members of the house. Grace teaches the others that life and death are connected and that living and dying is circular. Toward the end of the novel, Grace begins to have problems with her memory and behavior and ends her own life. Next, we have Clara. Clara is in her mid-80s and is in a wheelchair as a result to have suffered a stroke. Not only has she lost the youth of half her body, she also has lost small parts of her memory. She feels like a prisoner at Silver Gardens, but believes she is deserving of her fate because she gave up her daughter a long time ago to adoption. Clara is constantly observing others at George's house. Even though she cannot speak, she often is the voice of reason by communicating with her notepad. She lets the reader know through her internal monologue all that she feels, sees, hears, and thinks about her surroundings. Clara often daydreams of her days in Vegas where she performed on stage singing and playing the piano. Back then she loved her piano, white Russians, feathered boas, and men. After George's passing, Clara's daughter shows up with her daughter, who is pregnant, and they agree to stay, giving Clara the blood family she always thought she had lost forever. Next, we have 2 of my favorite characters, Fred and Emma. Having been married for 51 years, Emma is described as being a fat, whiny, bossy, and slow to change. Fred is suffocating from living with Emma in a small room at the Silver Gardens. He is so happy to move into George's mansion where he has some space from his overbearing wife and can enjoy his gin and freedom. Sadly, Fred collapses and dies right after he makes an incredible catch during one of George's baseball games. After convincing Emma, George and the others bury Fred in the backyard so he will always be with his family. Next up, we have Bert. Bert is a skinny, gray-haired widow who is an attachment to his old car he calls Gertie, and stuffed animal he's always acquired from his year as a taxidermist. Happy to have escaped from Silver Gardens, Bert is always willing to participate in one of George's adventures. Lastly, some of the discussion topics for our wiki page are as follows. The importance of social network for older adults and how this was created through George's vision. Mental and physical illness, how it affects and alters the characters in the novel. The importance of self-determination for older adults and the characters in this novel. And lastly, the concept of living life fully up until the end and how this was reflected through the characters' lifestyle and mentality.